Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. In this episode, on day 63, since 5-year-old Summer Wells disappeared, we're going to look at this idea of being abandoned, the psychology of abandonment. And when you Google those words, it's an adjective that means being deserted or left behind. The example they give is an abandoned car. Other words are deserted, forsaken, cast aside, stranded, rejected, but also other words like uninhibited, a wild abandoned dance, reckless, unrestrained, unbridled. I'm not going to deal with the prayer vigil that was held today, which is Tuesday, since it didn't really happen. Candace didn't show up, and it was sort of done virtually on Facebook. And in lieu of that, I'm going to be talking to you guys about something else. Before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. Like, share, leave a comment. Obviously, if comments are disabled, head on to Twitter using the hashtag SummerWells. And let's get started. So, no matter your theory, your position, your perspective, I think it's virtually certain that whatever happened to Summer, part of what that involved was Summer being abandoned. Intertextually, we see the same thing in both a symbolic way and in actuality. In other cases, John Bonet was abandoned symbolically via the ransom note. I mean, she wasn't actually kidnapped, but that was the story that was told. And in that story, she's abandoned from the narrator's perspective. But she was also abandoned by whoever was responsible for leaving her in the wine cellar. In the Madeleine McCann case, Madeleine was abandoned long enough for her to be taken. Madeleine was left behind in the apartment while her parents dined somewhere else. In that sense, she was abandoned. In the Gannon Store case, the little boy was abandoned several times, the last time under a highway bridge in Florida, 1,000 miles from home. I guess what I'm driving at is how implicit the psychology of abandonment is to the story. And I think it's easy to miss how this psychology can play out from the perspective not of the victim, but the other person. And so what I want to do is walk you through the operative psychological fabric.
Worth playing for?
Yeah.
So let's start with an analogy of frameworks. When I wrote Slaughter, what I believe is one of my best contributions to the true crime genre, one of the crucial leaps I needed to make to understand these shooters was to see that underneath everything else, there was a suicide. Regardless of the surrounding fabric, at the heart of all the worst of the worst individuals was simply someone who wanted to murder themselves. Once I saw that, I could also see that the motive was invariably the same across every single mass shooter. In a missing children's case, the underlying theme is abandonment. It's also not like the child is abandoned for the first time on the day he or she finally disappears. It's simply a case that by the time of the incident, abandonment has been practiced enough to become second nature. Now, we may understand intellectually what that means, but how about practically? Well,
unfortunately, no one can be told what the Matrix is. You have to see it for yourself.
And so when you hear Morpheus saying those words, the same applies in the true crime sense. No one can be told what this psychological matrix is. You have to see it. You have to experience it for yourself to truly understand that. And so that is what we're going to do now. Experience it.
Are you sure you want to hear this?
And so this brings us to an analogy from practical experience. I'm going to take you through a little adventure I had today. If you start to feel bored or feelings of impatience or thoughts like, what has this got to do with summer, come up, just give me and yourself a few moments. It'll start to dawn on you gradually. So give it a chance. Now, to put you in context, I've been extremely tired the last few days, but bordering on exhaustion the last day or so. Now, I'm not moaning or complaining. I need to tell you that in order for the abandonment scenario that's waiting for you later in the story to make a little bit more sense than it would without that context. So bear that in mind. Extremely tired and unusually stressed out. That's the carpet leading into this story. Now, I'm not going to go into the details why I was stressed, but all that matters is that due to an unusual compounding of very many different things, that was how I was feeling, right? Just accept that was the case. Okay, now let's get specific. So after this long day, and it's usually a long one when I don't get round to walking my dog, I needed to sit down and get some work done, but I felt so tired, I actually felt sick. So I went to lay down, and within moments of hitting the bed, I was asleep. It was a pretty good sleep too, let me tell you. Probably about 90 minutes into this amazing, restorative, healing sleep, the phone rang. Now, to give you an idea of how soothing the sleep was, the phone ringing was like this sharp, piercing, extremely loud, extremely unpleasant, harrowing explosion right next to my head. It was also this bright light in the darkness, waking up to this, all of these sharp, painful sensations and taking a while to process what on earth was going on. On the other end of the line was my father, sounding flustered, telling me he was lying in mud under his vehicle, not far from our farm, but on a very quiet road beyond the city limits. So he was at the side of the road trying to replace a flat tire, and could I come out immediately to help him? So I asked him, don't you have a jack, or do you need a jack? Do you need lighting? Because it was already dark outside. And he said, no, I need you to bring me a brick. That is what he sort of needed me there for, because he said every time that he set the jack up, the jack simply sank into the mud under the vehicle, so he wasn't able to lift it up. Now, I'm not going to lie. I really didn't want to get up and go out there. So just think about the situation. I'm lying in bed. It's cold. It's dark outside. I've been asleep, and now I've got to go from that to lying in the mud, in the cold outside, quite far away from that point, and struggling. And to be honest, I didn't understand why he even needed me to bring him a brick. Surely a rock isn't the hardest thing to find out there. I thought, maybe 5 minutes later he's going to find something like that anyway. The other side of it is, if I'd been ambulant when the call came instead of being in bed, just trying to get some rest, it probably wouldn't have been a big deal. But I did feel that there was this feeling of resistance and burden. Anyway, the call also came about an hour after sunset, and it's winter here right now, so it meant going out into the cold and dark to lie, as I say, under a vehicle in the mud. So that's the first impulse right there of the abandonment psychology. I really don't want to do this, right? That's the first thought. And bear in mind, as I said, all of this is within the context of being very tired and very stressed. And now this is something else that's got to be dealt with. And it's this feeling of, I really don't want to do this. And so you're almost in a compromised state as you venture out into this particular adventure, right? So I think one should ask the question, given all of these things, why didn't I abandon my father? I mean, I didn't abandon him, but why didn't I? Well, I guess because I understood that I could help him, and that I was probably the closest person that could respond to him, and also the quickest to reaching him. And that is besides our bond as a father and son, obviously. So there were some practical reasons, but obviously also some relationship reasons why it would make sense for me to help him, and it would make sense for him to call me, and that I would respond, right? So this is the important part now. Now let's apply all of that to Summer Wells. What if, whatever the situation was on June 15th, what if someone understood that Summer couldn't be helped, right? So in other words, this is a situation where I'm going to help my father, but the help is actually to help him with his vehicle. Now, what if I understood that that vehicle cannot be helped? There's nothing that can be done to save the vehicle, right? So what if in this situation, someone understood that Summer couldn't be helped and that she was beyond help? And what if in that situation, the logical recourse was to abandon Summer not by not going to her, not by just sort of putting the phone down and going back to sleep, not that, but by going to her and taking her somewhere else where she'd be beyond everyone's reach, right? And, why would one person be called to do this more than another? Well, perhaps because of their bond as a certain family member, perhaps because of the bond of a certain family member and a daughter. Does that make sense? Now, moments before driving out, I just searched around for a brick, and I found two, one that was broad and flat, almost like a tile, and then another that was conventional brick. But on my way out, there was a diversion in the road where the road was sort of under construction. And as I pulled into a smaller side road, I'm kind of going on an unusual route now. I'm being diverted from the main road by this construction that I've never seen before. And while that's happening, another vehicle pulls in. Instead of waiting for me to come past, pulls in, almost sideswipes me, and I kind of lose it. I swear loudly through the window at him. I'm really sort of agitated. And while my vehicle is sort of rooming fast in the dark, now back on the main road, beyond the city limits, I'm sort of hearing my own voice and what I've shouted at this guy replaying to me in the silence. And I'm thinking, jeepers, you are really stressed out. Calm down, right? But that sort of incident is making me realize, wow, I'm really, really stressed out. Anyway, so as I'm driving towards my father, I start to comprehend a fairly untenable situation that we're in. My dad is no spring chicken, but he's out there alone in the dark and quite vulnerable, right? It's kind of a rural area. I'm not going to go into that in too much detail, but I started worrying as I drove, and I drove fast and fast. I started worrying, was he okay? Was he safe? And also wondering, by the time I got there, wouldn't he have gotten himself sorted anyway? Wouldn't someone else have stopped and maybe they'd found a rock nearby? What if a good Samaritan had stopped, or if while waiting for me, he'd somehow stumbled on a suitable brick or rock to prop the jack onto? What if he'd just kind of come right? Now, once again, let's apply this to Summer Wells. What if on his way to the scene, Summer may have been intercepted by someone else? Wasn't that this person's concern as well? I need to get there very soon to take care of the situation. Okay, now let's go back to my story. Again, I'm not going to take you through too much of the details that follow. There are a lot, but in summary, when I arrived there, the turf under my father's vehicle wasn't really muddy at all. It wasn't quite as bad as I'd imagined it to be. It was a sort of grassy mulch, but nevertheless the grass itself was quite dry. It only gave way once you started using the jack to hoist the vehicle in the air. Then it would press down into this fairly soft soil, and it would create a hole in the ground. And so you needed a platform that would prevent that from happening. And although it seemed pretty straightforward, it wasn't. So even with me bringing these bricks to my father, it wasn't just a case that he just suddenly hoisted the vehicle in the air. It was a struggle. It was getting things partially done, then it would slip off the jack, and there was also kind of a sense of, was the car going to fall onto him, as well. And bear in mind, with a Land Rover, it needs to be lifted quite a height into the air, which is quite precarious in a way. And bear in mind, underneath the tires, it's muddy, so the chance of the vehicle slipping onto you is quite high. So there's that sense of peril, that you're putting yourself in danger in order to deal with this vehicle that is kind of in trouble, right? So I'd estimate while I was on the scene, about 45 minutes passed simply trying to get this jack in place. And you like the way I expected it would be 5 or 10 minutes. Just put the jack in place, pump it up, and you're done. And it just wasn't as simple as that. Every time it would slip off, and there was this fiddling and struggling in the dark to set it up again, only for the same thing to happen. And I also wanted to take control of the situation. I wanted to be hands-on. I wanted to set the jack up myself, but I had to kind of be aware of the relationship with my father. He's a guy who likes to do things his way, and he was under the vehicle to begin with, and quite focused on what he was doing. But anyway, each time he'd set it up and it would fail, and I started feeling a growing sense of alarm and impatience. Alarm because in the pitch dark at the side of the road in rural South Africa, it's definitely not the safest place in the world, to put it mildly. Impatience because we didn't have all night to do what we wanted to do. We didn't have all night to sort out the situation. There's a coronavirus curfew in my country, and everyone's got to be home by 10 o'clock. So we kind of had a limited period of time to sort out the situation. And it was actually taking a really long time just to try and get the vehicle hoisted in the air, right? And then once we achieved that, which took almost an hour, then there was another problem. So the thought definitely started occurring to me to abandon his vehicle, right? To lock it up and come back for it the next morning. But even though the thought occurred to me, I didn't say anything. I just thought about it. Now, once again, let's apply this to Summer Wells. The thought definitely occurred to me to abandon her, to lock it up, to come back for it the next morning. However, at this point, I didn't say anything. And perhaps someone in a secondary role or a tertiary role, perhaps someone like Grandma, may have felt herself getting sucked into an increasingly dire, messy situation, and may have felt increasingly a need to just get it over and done with. I'm not going to argue. Let's just sort out this unpleasant situation, right? And so back to my adventure. Eventually, we got the vehicle jacked up, only to find that the spare tire was the wrong one. It simply didn't align. Now, I'm not going to go through why that was. It was just really frustrating for me to have reached this point, and now it's like, now what? And that's when the original thought to abandon the vehicle almost seemed like the most logical thought. I mean, if we didn't have a spare tire, what were you going to do? This was an impossible situation to get out of then and there, right? Back to how to apply this to the Summer Wells psychology. That's when the original thought to abandon the girl almost seemed like the most logical thought. Okay, now back to my adventure, which let's call it a misadventure. Obviously, it's because it's not my vehicle, and so it's not really my ego at stake. It would have been quite easy to make the suggestion, of abandoning the vehicle beside the road overnight, right? But even at this point, I didn't say anything. My father suggested we drive back to the farm and search through the stable areas. There's no lighting really there. It would be searching in the dark for spare tires. And I really didn't like this idea. But I went along with it. It just seemed like we were getting deeper and deeper into something that was seemingly had less and less of a chance of success. But he knew his vehicle better and the situation better, and he was relying on me, so I went along with it. Long story short, we did find a tire, and it was an identical match to the wrong one that we tried to fit. And so there was more searching in the dark until we eventually found another tire. And that one did appear like it might be a better fit. The only problem was it was really old. It looked like it could have been 20 years old, and the tire itself was almost completely flat. So there was the risk that you're now going to fit a tire onto a vehicle that's actually flat anyway. It's no different to the one that you've already fitted. And so back to an analogy with the Summer Wells case. Listen to this. Obviously, if it's my ego at stake and it's really up to me to fix the situation, abandoning beside the road overnight is going to be up to me. And now back to my misadventure. From here we drove past the stricken 4x4. So now we gotten the tire, and we go back to where the vehicle is, but we don't even stop there. We go right by it, and we head somewhere else to the nearest garage. And all of this is an attempt to do something about this problem. And so we go to the nearest garage, we find the right-sized spare tires almost completely flat, and the test now would be, has it perished over time? When I pump it up, will it do its job? And thankfully it did. When we got back to the vehicle, there were a few individuals walking by, shadows in the dark. So you got the sense of tension, of danger, that you can't just be out there for ages and, if you just slowly, meticulously do it, you'll be fine. There was a sense of urgency and almost panic, right? I think overall 3 vehicles stopped to offer help, which in that period of time was very little. 2 stopped, and I actually spoke to the people directly and I thanked them. One, the last one, I think was quite nervous. He sort of pulled up, and I was sort of walking quite quickly along the far side, and I had a silver wrench in my hand, and I suspect that he thought that was something else, because he suddenly pulled away and drove off. And he may have thought that was something that was not a silver wrench glistening in my hand, right? My father actually remarked that these bystanders, these people driving by, probably wanted to help, but probably felt afraid to help, and I think with good reason. And there's a slight analogy there too for abandonment. These strangers driving by, kind of abandoning us to our fate, right? Anyway, I can't remember the details of the vehicles, but I can tell you that the last was a red truck, kind of a metallic red, the one that pulled away, as though the guy had gotten a fright. Another was a sedan, and I think the third was a white truck. Now let's go back to an analogy with the Summer Wells case. The analogy here is that a third party could well have helped us, had we accepted their help, had the people in the case accepted their help. I don't think in that case it would have been someone random and someone unknown, but there could have been a third party involved that offered to help, and that help was accepted. I think the critical aspect to emphasize here is the major aspect driving the issue of abandoning is stress and the sense of being in peril. Take that away, put the whole scene in daylight or in your own driveway, and suddenly everything changes. But add layers of alarm and peril, stress and exhaustion, and the thinking to abandon naturally increases. So let's go back to the misadventure now. So the third spare wheel turned out also to be not quite right, and some of the tire bolts had actually gone missing that we'd removed, but we made it work, and we sourced a few additional bolts without too much hassle. And I did mention to my father on the drive to pumping up the one tire. I said, if this was me, I don't know if I would play dice with a vehicle. I don't know if I would feel sorting out a vehicle is worth risking my life, Anyway, what if we replace the characters in my story with Don and Candace, or even Grandma? So what if my dad is Candace? So I'm coming to Candace's assistance, and the vehicle is Summer. Or if I'm Grandma and my dad is Candace and the vehicle is Don. What I'm trying to show you is a dynamic with something that's not a person, or perhaps no longer a person. Something that would be, in certain dangerous circumstances, logical to abandon, because to not do so would imperil me. Does that make sense? So I'm not going to take it further than that. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.